the newsagents.
We're a week on from the night, that Friday, when the allegations about Russell Brand first emerged, via Russell Brand himself, spiking the story from the Sunday Times and Channel 4 via his own YouTube channel. A week on, and a Metropolitan Police investigation has started, and more allegations have surfaced. The BBC reporting on Thursday that they had interviewed a woman who alleges that Brand had exposed himself to her and then laughed about it on his Radio 2 show. These allegations, like all the allegations, Brand denies. Someone like Brand is hard for most of us to ever know, to ever truly begin to understand what is beneath the mask. He has been so ubiquitous, lived his life so publicly, and yet, partly because, self-evidently, his character is confection, or rather confection upon confection, onion-like, it is hard to have any sense of who he really is, what he's really like, what his mind might truly be. Few people have that insight, but if anyone does, it's Gordon Smart. He's a man who has spent nearly all his adult life in the world of tabloid journalism, one of Rupert Murdoch's protégés. He worked his way up with ink-stained fingers through Murdoch's stable of papers, a stint at the News of the World, editor of the Scottish Sun, deputy editor of the Sun, and before that a young showbiz editor of the paper, with the power to make or break celebrity careers. He was the one who awarded Brand that now infamous title of Shagger of the Year 3 times before retiring it, saying no one could possibly match his record. In that job, Smart became embedded in that lustrous celebrity world. He became close to a whole suite of the famous faces who dominated our popular culture over the last 15 years, including Brand. It was, let's say, a fast-paced lifestyle. Smart seldom talks about it, but given the events of the last week, he came into the newsagent studio for a conversation with Emily and me about Brand, his time in tabloids, the Murdoch succession, and whether he wants or needs to atone for anything in those days, the things he wrote in that heady past. It's Lewis here. Welcome to the Newsagents. It's Lewis.
It's Emily.
And we are in Newsagents HQ, and Gordon Smart is with us. Welcome,
Thanks
Gordon,
for having me. Yeah.
to our little bunker here. We should just start, just in case people aren't familiar with you and your work as a journalist, just to give a little précis of your career, because you're only what, you're 43?
43. Yeah,
43, but you've had an amazing, extraordinary career, long time, having a sort of ringside seat in the Murdoch Empire, News UK, News International Empire, that very few people would have. So just give people a bit of a summary of that.
Well, first of all, it's slightly painful coming in here for a year, walking past you a couple of times every week, and not being recognised at all. You know? But then the day I came in with Martin Compston, Emily and John Soper were like, "Oh, hi Martin, hello." And I thought, 15 years in newspapers, over 1,000 radio shows.
God, I'm going to get this out really early. I have facial blindness.
All right, okay.
Yeah.
I
She barely
promise you.
recognises me.
I don't know who that man opposite is. The Queen walked past occasionally, and I was just like, I see you've got a crown on. No, I'm trying here. Haven't got a clue.
She's not grand
I'm
at all.
I'm really facially blind.
Well,
so
anyway,
please don't take it.
This is Lewis.
It's just a fellow who just talks about Harold Wilson a lot.
He's shown real promise in journalism. Yeah, it's been a crazy story, because I started my career in journalism in Dundee at DC Thompson's in 1998. I set up a school newspaper. Didn't realise I wanted to be a journalist until we revealed that my art teacher was in Wet, Wet, Wet when he was younger. And then I suddenly found out I was a tabloid journalist by accident. And a local journalist heard about this, and I got a chance to work for the Courier and Evening Telegraph in Dundee, and thoroughly enjoyed it. Lived in Dundee for 6 months as a junior reporter. Then went to university, studied journalism, which was a bit of a carry-on, really. It wasn't the most academic of courses, I would say. But I had a great time in Edinburgh, and then couldn't get a job in journalism for love nor money, because moved down to London, thought the streets were paved with gold, ended up working as a football coach in Surrey. And then I got my big break in Edinburgh for a news agency called Deadline Scotland, where a couple of my friends from university were working. And I worked for every newspaper in Scotland. It was great. You get sent on a shift for the Herald or the Scotsman or the Evening News or the Daily Record or the Mail or whoever it happened to be at the time. Hardest year of my life, incredibly difficult. Doing all the stuff you don't want to do in journalism, really, that, go knock on that door and see if you can get a collect picture of a child who's died in an accident. Really difficult stuff. And then MTV Europe came to Edinburgh in 2002, and all the tabloid journalists had come up for this big event, Kylie Minogue and Vin Diesel and Justin Timberlake were all there. But because I knew the city so well, I managed to get various people into various nightclubs and help them out. They managed to get some stories, and I was offered a chance on Fleet Street by Victoria Newton, the now editor of The Sun.
And what was a tabloid? What was it like working for a tabloid paper?
Oh, it was terrifying when I first moved to London. You know, on my first day, they sat me next to a guy called Sean Hoare, who you might be familiar with. He was the whistleblower on phone hacking. And Sean, on a Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, said, "Golden Son, do you want a drink?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd love a drink," thinking he'd make me a cup of tea. And he pulled out a bottle of Tia Maria and poured me a full plastic cup of Tia Maria. And I said, "Are you joking?" He went, no, on you go." And I said, "You're all right, Sean." So he drank it, poured himself another one and drank it and said, "Right, we're going to the pub." So he took me to the pub on Tuesday morning, 10 o'clock. He was banging on it was called the Rose on the highway in London, in Wapping. And the landlord answered in his dressing gown and said, "God, Sean, you only left 4 hours ago." And he opened the pub up, and I had a pint of Guinness and a whiskey before 11 o'clock on my first day on Fleet Street. And I thought, I don't know if I'm going to be able to survive this. And that was my introduction to tabloid journalism on Fleet Street in Wapping, working for Rupert Murdoch.
And did that culture, I mean, because the culture of has been very much under the spotlight, particularly this week, particularly with Russell Brand allegations, the way people are now looking back, probably at a slightly later time, but the 2000s, the 2010s, that kind of time as being, you know, very kind of booze-fueled, very reckless, very, very sort of in-your-face, sexed up. I mean, do you think that was something that the tabloids brought to the culture, or do you think they took it away from the culture of the time?
It's an interesting way to look at it. I mean, I can only give you the experience I had when I started there as a 22, 23-year-old. And you're right, it was boozed up. It was all about drinking when I started. You know, the first feature I was asked to write for the News of the World was hangover cures. So the backbench and the editors devised the most potent collection of drinks to give me the most aggressive hangover. And then I had to test hangover cures for a week. And I remember and I wanted to impress. I wanted to, you know, I think I was earning £12,000 a year in Scotland.
They just got you drunk every day?
They just got me drunk every day.
How old were you?
22. And then I remember Neil Wallace, one of the editors at the paper, got me into conference on day 3 and said, "Right, we've got the jock here. How are you coping? It can't be a problem for you being a jock, can it?" And I said, "Well, I'm not feeling great, to be completely honest, but the hangover cures, I'm testing them, trying to give a sensible answer." But it was a bear pit. It was an absolute bear pit.
Did you say no to anything?
No, I didn't, because I was determined to get my foot in the ladder and make a career for myself. And I'm sure a lot of people did the same thing. You know, it was quite at the same time, there were people who were incredibly encouraging, and I did learn some stuff, but I was only there for 2 months and then moved to The Sun. But it was the same culture again. You know, they used to keep a leaderboard for who could run from the news desk to the pub, have a pint and come back, and there was, you know, the quickest times, and it was a challenge to see if you could exist on it. But the pressure to deliver stories was absolutely massive as well. And the other thing that was quite interesting that people didn't often understand is the culture of how much The Sun and the News of the World hated each other. Because when I turned up, I just assumed they were bedfellows, same papers, would support each other, but it was...
Big mistake.
Oh, God. I remember saying it and everyone went, "What?" But yeah, you just have to survive. And, you know, I was young and fortunately had an incredibly supportive wife. I was married incredibly young, got married at 23. And she supported me all the way. She worked in the West End and was in musical theatre, so she kind of understood that we were going to have an unsociable life. But yeah, you know, and answer to your question, it was a bear pit. It was full of booze. I think at the time I started, David Blaine was doing his stunt in the box at Tower Bridge,
box, yeah.
And there was a reporter living in a plastic box in the office because they thought they would test him and see how long he could survive.
They had one.
They had a reporter in a box, yeah, Sean Hoare. They put him in a box to see how long he'd last.
At least it wasn't you.
I know. I was very grateful it wasn't me because I probably agreed to do it back then.
I was going to say, Gordon, did you see stuff that you didn't like? And I mean that in a kind of more profound way than, "Oh, I don't like that." Like, you really didn't like that stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, listen, I am on the record extensively in the Leveson inquiry and criminal inquiries with my views on what I did and didn't see. But culturally, yeah, I saw stuff that I thought was horrific, you know. But then my attitude was, I was a young person going into the workplace for the first time. I kind of assumed that's what it was like, getting your way in the world.
Wolf of Wall Street.
Yeah, just, you know, I heard horrific stories about things that were happening with my friends who worked in building sites and people who were working in the city, or, you know, the culture and the medical profession was pretty brutal as well. Long hours, hard partying, wild lifestyles. So I just assumed that was part of growing up. It's only now with time to reflect and look back on it you realise just how brutal it was and how hard it was. I'm very grateful that I've come out of it relatively unscathed, and I think we all have to be very careful of it, sitting on Mount Hindsight in 2023 looking back on it. I think I'm a very different person now.
Well, talking about hindsight and about things that we've been talking about this week, obviously something you had a connection with when you were at the paper, which has really weirdly resurfaced this week as a result of Brand and the Brand allegations, is this thing like Shagger of the Year. I mean, a lot of people are looking back at that now and thinking, what was all that about?
Yeah.
How could that have been? What are your reflections on that now?
Well, I never thought I'd be sitting in a room with Emily Maitlis and you, Lewis, having a conversation about Shagger of the Year. It depends on the day you catch me. Some days I feel quite belligerent about it and think, well, it was, that was the Sun, that was the culture at the time, that was part of the paper. Was it your
idea, the Shagger?
No, it wasn't actually. I inherited it. It was, in fact, it was Victoria Newton who gave Russell Brand the first Shagger of the Year award, the now editor of The Sun, female editor. And, we used to have an annual awards ceremony that had stuff like Caner of the Year, Shagger of the Year, Best Album, all the rest of it. But that was the one that got the most interest. And, I don't ever remember having a conversation, and I had a few, by the way. There were some great people that took me aside and said, "Are you sure about this?" And that was one that everybody seemed to laugh about at the time. And looking back at it now, of course I'm embarrassed about it. So I've got a 13-year-old son and a 10-year-old girl who ask me questions about working for that newspaper. And sometimes I feel my toes curling in my shoes. I feel embarrassed talking about it now. But then other times I think, well, you can't rewrite history. That's what happened. I was a 23-year-old bloke amidst lad culture off the back of growing up in the 90s, which I just felt like part of that firmament, that universe of fairly bad behaviour. But at the time it felt like it was acceptable. It's not an excuse. I realise it sounds appalling, and I know a lot of your listeners will be really offended by it, and I'm actually quite sorry for a lot of the stuff that appeared, but there's nothing I can do about it now. It's happened.
I'm guessing a lot of our listeners will be thinking there were worse things that happened at The Sun than Shagger of the Year, actually.
Yeah, and there probably were. Yeah.
Do you think that we over-intellectualise this stuff?
I think we tend to.
In the sense that, just to explain that, I mean, in the sense that maybe we're looking back and, okay, Shagger of the Year, you can argue about it, maybe it wasn't their best taste, but it was a sort of joke. But actually, it only looks like a bad joke now because of what we now know Brand was doing and what he was like.
Even more appalling
Allegedly.
in light of those alleged crimes. But I'm really conflicted about a lot of stuff that happened, and a lot of things I wrote in the paper. The language wasn't right. The way I wrote about women, I'm uncomfortable with now. But then you have to take that, and I know what you mean about over-intellectualising it. You have to look at the broader picture of everything else that was going on at the same time. FHM, Nuts, Loaded magazine, the Radio 1 breakfast show was pretty toxic at the time. If you listen back to some of the stuff that happened, if you watch chat shows...
Well, the Big Breakfast was in bed, wasn't it?
Yeah, Big Breakfast, Letterman, the way he was interviewing young women, there was a lot that was wrong with the world, and it takes time to analyse it and appreciate it and get your head around it. And I left 7 years ago, and I look back at a lot of that and think, oh, Gordon, God, what were you doing? But there is nothing I can do about it now. And I think as a man in my 20s, I was playing a load of football, hanging around with loads of lads, working for the Sun newspaper. And I always felt like I played a bit of a character. I wasn't really the person I think I am.
You hung around a lot with Russell Brand. I mean, would you call him a mate? Yeah.
Well, this is a great question again, because are people in the public eye, when you work as a showbiz journalist, truly your friends? And that's been quite a difficult thing for me to get my head around. Did I think I was friends with Russell? I think I did, yeah. But only
did you like him?
I did, yeah. At the time, I thought he was a really entertaining, gregarious, effervescent character who was at the top of his game. This is the thing, you've got the public persona of Russell Brand, the backcombed hair, the Victorian chimney sweep, the incredibly... he had a beautiful vocabulary, didn't he? He would charm everybody he met, but then he would overstep the mark, and you'd think, oh, God, Russell, that's about a line. But then privately, and I think you've experienced this, when you have a conversation with him, he's really thoughtful. We used to call him snake eyes, because he would look in your eyes, and if I catch your glance and your glaze, I'd look in one eye, but he would do this thing where he would dart between your eyes, and you'd feel quite hypnotised by it. It was quite unnerving. But he was incredibly well read, an intelligent guy. We had really long conversations about Amy Winehouse, for instance, and Focus 12 and Alcoholics Anonymous and NA. 12 steps, all that kind of stuff, because he was always trying to encourage me to give up drinking. But, you know, at the same time, I would normally be in his company where there'd be a gig or an event, or we'd been to see Oasis or Noel Gallagher, or he'd been doing a gig, or we'd be at something together. It's not like I was going round to his house for Sunday lunch, as real friends would do. And, you know, you process that period of my life. And, you know, it was a similar thing with, went to James Corden's wedding and David Walliam's 40th and his wedding. But then I was moved back to Scotland when I was 33 to be editor up there. And suddenly, you know, a lot of people evaporate. And, you know, it's that
Well, they can't quite make it to Scotland.
Yeah, and then I start getting Christmas cards from Ed Miliband, who I'd never met. So, you know, the similarities between politics and showbiz are real. You know, you have the political party, the talent, the electorate. Showbiz is exactly the same thing, and it is equally brutal and ugly and unpleasant, and it chews you up and spits you out. And you're very fortunate if you meet a few people in the middle of that who are genuine friends. And Russell, you know, we went through an awful lot at the same time. You know, it was quite a difficult job. You know, I had to hold down a family at the same time. I'd travel a lot. And then, you know, invariably with people like Russell, bad stories would come along, and I'd have to make a phone call and say, look, what's the truth behind this?
Like what? What sort of stories?
Well, there'd be countless kiss and tells. You know, again, to give the full picture of the Russell Brand situation, women were throwing themselves at Russell. You know, if you went to one of his gigs, people would queue up to meet him and want to go home with him and spend time with him and sleep with him. You know, that was the culture of what was going on. And it's not just Russell. I think, you know, gigs, music, there was quite a bad culture of that. But I'm not for a second, please make it absolutely clear, defending him in any way, but the culture around that whole scene was disgusting.
So did you ask yourself, and I'm really conscious that, you know, hindsight is a wonderful thing and all the rest of it, but so this is a genuine question. This is not me trying to, like, you know, spear you. Did your mind kind of go, what the fuck is he up to with these young women, or with this quantity of women, or did you just kind of park that in a place of, like, he is Shagger of the Year, but he's not, you know, potentially criminal? I don't know. I don't know what you're sort of thinking.
I don't think you
at the
can
time.
park it as clearly that in two camps. There'd be moments where you think that I don't think that's right. You know, like Russell had a relationship, I think, with Courtney Love, and there were stories talked about what happened between them, but they were consenting adults. And I remember thinking that the things that were happening sounded really uncomfortable to me. But then,
like what?
I don't want to go into the details of it. It's really vulgar stuff, right? But I remember thinking that's, and also bear in mind, Russell had written Bookie Wook at this point, and in his book he talked about stuff that I thought was pretty true to psychopathic behaviour, right? His dog wasn't allowed upstairs, so Russell said in the book, I would then take my dog upstairs and say, you're not allowed here, and then throw the dog down the stairs. I remember that being a moment where I thought, this guy, is this a horrible act? And I had to interview him about the book, right? So that happened, and then there was another story about his next door neighbour had planted beautiful flowers and had said, now Russell, don't trample anywhere near my flowers. So Russell went and trampled on the flowers because he said that was his inner monologue. And at that point I thought, this guy doesn't realise the narcissism, the ego, the badness in him. But then I met a lot of curious characters.
Gordon, let me put it another way. I mean, when you heard the allegations this week, were you surprised?
Oh, I wasn't surprised, no, because I'd heard that the investigation had been going on for a number of years. Whether or not that would lead to publication or a broadcast of a documentary, I wasn't entirely sure, because the burden of proof is so heavy, isn't it? And, you know, to get, I mean, the incredible bravery of the women to speak up about that and work with journalists to prove the information that was in there is incredible. So it wasn't a surprise. I watched the documentary with my wife on Saturday night, and she got very angry. I got really depressed, felt really sad about it all, because I felt complicit in celebrating his behaviour.
What was her anger?
Oh, she's just a number of things. She was very angry about, once again, my relationships through the newspaper causing me to be upset and her to be upset. And mainly anger about what the women had suffered at his hands. Just generally, I think the same emotions all of us felt when we watched it. It's just like, oh God, we were all sucked into this nonsense. And Kate had met him loads of times, yeah. You know, I don't know.
No, was she angry with you?
Was she angry with me? It's quite difficult to tell sometimes, you know, because we have these conversations so regularly at the moment. You know, there's a lot of stuff happening in relation to my work in tabloid newspapers that has been going on for over 10 years, you know, since Levison. And if you think about it, up until that point, I wasn't in a position where I was considering really the ethics of what I was doing. I was just so busy trying to deliver a newspaper on a 7-day basis, right? Let's not forget, at one point it was 7 days a week. And then all of a sudden, you're a little bit older. You've been asked to really consider the ethics of what you're doing. You've been asked to consider the implications of the people you're writing about. The culture's changing, people are changing. Social media is playing a big part in that. You feel incredibly accountable for what you're doing.
And scared, presumably. You think, well, they could come after me.
Yeah, of course. And I genuinely think I'm a decent, well-rounded human being. I'm very fortunate to have been brought up very well by my parents. I had an incredible childhood. I think I know right from wrong. And I think I know to call out bad behaviour when it's in front of me. But then, again, we're talking about hindsight. Did I ever tell Russell he was out of line? I'm pretty sure I've on occasion said, "What you up to? What you doing? Is that right?" And let's not think for a second that culture has changed too much. It's just hidden away a lot of it. Young men communicate inappropriately, I still think, on WhatsApp. It's just not done in the same way through TV and media, because I think it's better. There's better regulation.
Do you think the power dynamics within celebrity have changed?
Well,
i.e., there could be the same dynamics at play potentially today.
Yeah, I think that's definitely still exists. I used to find it really quite upsetting that people would be afraid of me. Why would you be scared of me? You've got no reason to be fearful.
Who's afraid of you?
Well, for celebrities, it happens all the time. Now I'm out of that of News UK, and I'm out
because
of the Sun.
you carried their reputations in your hand, and you could crush them. I mean, let's be honest.
I could have done, but
a bad picture or a bad bit of gossip could have destroyed someone.
Well, not so much a bad picture, but I think a bad story. But then my attitude would be, if you've got nothing to fear, what's the issue? I don't really see why I should be feared. I didn't turn up every day rubbing my hands together looking to ruin people's lives, and I know people might find that a bit unusual. I turned up thinking I'm going to get to do incredible stuff and meet incredible people as a result of having this huge amplifier and speaker that I'm plugged into.
Did you ever at any point say to Russell Brand when you knew him that you thought he was going too far about something that he was doing, or something?
I've asked that question a lot over the years. I think I probably have. I can't give you a specific example, but we've had really challenging conversations over the years. I know for a fact, and this is a really, really important point to make, there are a lot of good people who are victims of Russell's as well, in a different way, because of his behaviour, his bullying, his manipulation. And there are a lot of people suffering at the moment as a result of this, because they're questioning their role in what happened. And people called him out. People definitely called him out. And then Russell is an incredibly charming man and would turn that back and say, "How dare you question me?" or how can you say that? And you'll see from his career history and the people he's worked with that they've fallen by the wayside as a result of that.
He would bully people.
I think Russell is an incredibly intimidating person when he wants to be. Not just with his command of language, he's a physically imposing character. He's 6'3", right? When you add the backcomb hair in and the makeup and everything, he is an intimidating man. And often what you would find is very senior people wouldn't want to have difficult conversations, so they would ask those people closer to him to deal with those difficult conversations.
I guess the place we're in at the moment, Gordon, is that a lot of people will be going, "Oh yeah, well, I knew about Russell Brand, it was an open secret, oh, we all knew that, but we couldn't say anything because there were no allegations, there's no actual investigation." And I don't want you to name names because our lawyers will be all over it. But are you thinking now back to that period and thinking, yeah, I've got probably 5 more people that I wouldn't be surprised could be the subject of exactly this kind of sexual assault or even alleged rape investigation? Do you think and have worked closely with people now in public life, celebrities?
I have grave reservations, definitely. And I'm sure if you asked any prominent person in the media who's held a position like mine or like yours, would be in a position to say, I've heard stories. But then that's a very different thing, and I'm uncomfortable with the notion of the open secret because it is potentially libelous. If you're in possession of hard evidence that could lead to a criminal conviction, you're morally obligated, in my opinion, to go and do something about that. If without the evidence, without the proof, you can't really do anything, can you? I don't think. There are things you can encourage. You can encourage brilliant investigative journalists, and I think that's why the press in this country is so important, because they can still hold those feet to the flames on inappropriate behaviour. But yes, I am gravely concerned about other stuff.
You work closely. You were Victoria Newton's deputy. I wonder what you made of the Sun scoop at the beginning of the summer. With Hugh Edwards, where it sounded like, I know you weren't part of this, you weren't working there, but you will know Victoria's work. It sounded like they had spoken extensively to the parents of the person concerned, but they hadn't included the response of the person. And I don't even know if they went to Hugh Edwards' himself on that. I mean, was that a badly flawed investigation?
It's interesting to see the prism you look at it through, and also bearing in mind I have no obligation. I don't work for the company anymore. It's been 7 years. I do know Victoria very well, but I also work for the BBC now, so I have to be careful what I say. But both of you know very well, as experienced journalists, that the burden of proof and the legal responsibility that exists in corroborating a story or standing a story up is incredibly heavy. The legal team and the legal support of that paper is world class, and there is this notion that there's a cavalier attitude towards people, or a cavalier attitude towards publication of information, is just not accurate at all. The loopholes that you have to jump through and the work that has to be done to publish a story like that is incredibly rigorous.
But the story wasn't accurate, was it? I mean, I think at one stage
I don't know. I think only one person really truly knows the answer to that question.
It was about how it was presented.
Or maybe two or three. Yeah, the question here is about the presentation of the story, and I also feel uncomfortable about silhouette stories and anonymity, because it always felt to me like you're throwing everybody under the bus, right? And you have to be incredibly careful about it. I think Jeremy Vine was successfully sued, didn't he, for social media. Somebody said that he was the person involved, and £1,000 was paid to a charity as a result. There's an awful lot at play here, right? And I think if you think back, there was a brilliant cartoon in the Times during the Leveson inquiry, and it was Lord Leveson sitting at his desk, big mahogany desk, pile of papers, culture, standards, practices and ethics of newspapers, and then the Twitter bird was flying above him, and it was doing its business on his head. And I think there were 4 or 5 pages for social media on the Leveson inquiry. On the morning, I think one of the mornings I was going to give evidence, there was a murder on Oxford Street, and there was a body under a tarpaulin with a police cordon around it, which was respected by the Evening Standard. Another terrible murder, young person, knife crime, London. But on social media, there was a picture of the corpse with the knife sticking out of the chest, with messages saying another soldier down in London, right? So there's a strange thing where everybody in the world's a publisher now, and we all have to really think about what we say and we commit to the media. And I've read some horrendously libelous stuff on social media in the last couple of weeks.
But the Sun is the Sun.
Of course it is, yeah.
I mean,
I'm talking about the broader picture here, but to give you the perspective on what the paper had to go through to even publish that story in the first place. Victoria is an excellent journalist. She's an incredibly bright woman, and she would not make a decision like that without considering it at great length. And incidentally, the nature of the way that business is set up, there are bigger questions that go higher up before publication of a story like that happens.
What's your relationship
Sorry, what did you mean? It went to Murdoch?
Well, I don't know if it went as far as him, but certainly council in New York. I think there's a bigger business at play, isn't there? And huge stories like that have huge implications.
Need sign off.
Would always go up as far as they could possibly go. Certainly, I can speak as somebody who's edited the paper. I would want to make sure, if a big decision like that was being made, everybody was completely aware of what was going on. And Victoria is an incredibly meticulous, diligent, hard-working human being, and she would have done all that rigorous checking beforehand.
What's your relationship with Bran like now?
I haven't spoken to him since I checked my messages, 2001. He worked under this roof for Global.
2021?
2021, my mistake, sorry. Just probably he was asking me about Succession.
Oh, right.
What was he asking you?
Well, all the same questions. Which character were you? Were you Cousin Greg? Oh, thanks, yeah.
Were you?
Well, who were you?
Yeah, probably, yeah. My teeth sticking to my lips because I was so nervous and out of my depth. Yeah. No, I don't think I was ever important enough to be part of the thinking of that, although I could write another series, I'm sure. But yeah, he was messaging me about that, asking which character was which and who it was based on. And that was the last time I had any contact with him.
What do you think? I mean, you know his mind well, you know him well. What do you think he'll be thinking?
I don't think I know his mind well. I don't think.
Well, you know him well.
I know him. Yeah, I know him. I think you could see from, I was talking about his eyes and the way they would dart looking at you. I think he looked terrified in the clip he posted on Friday before publication. But, Russell, I think, is a narcissist. I think he's borderline psychopath, definitely a sociopath. I think the way the arguments unfolding I find quite disgusting, really, because it's actually about alleged victims of sexual assault, and for the conversation to be about demonetising him feels to me like it will play to his agenda of this is the establishment out to get me, which is wrong, because it's not about that. It's about young women who were allegedly attacked.
You've said a couple of times now that you think he's a sociopath or potentially a psychopath. I mean, that's amazing, really, in a sense that, again, you know pretty well. And what does that say about us in our society then?
That we
put,
yeah.
if you think he's right, that he's got this substantial mental problems, that we've put him up in lights and celebrated him for so many years,
There's
and
a
potentially
long
ignored.
history of that, isn't there? That's such a long history.
We probably
of that.
think
And
similar
politics
things
is
of
the
Elon
same.
Musk, don't
Yeah.
we? We think he's a kind of...
We can't have this conversation without talking about politics, can we? Look at the people who get into power who are flawed individuals. We are, as humans, flawed people. And we're all driven by different things, some for the right reasons, some for the wrong reasons. And I think that ultimately you will be found out if you do something that's inappropriate. And I think Russell will have to face justice.
Do you
indeed
believe him
found
when
guilty.
he's often said, again, talking about over-intellectualising, he said that he's a sex addict?
I
Do you
find
think
that
that's
notion,
right?
I actually heard Emily talking about this, I find that really uncomfortable, again, because it's a behaviour that you can say no, I think you can stop yourself from doing that. A medical addiction to a drug, I think, is a slightly different thing. I'm sure somebody could argue very eloquently against that point of view, but I find it uncomfortable.
Do you think that in the end, obviously it depends what happens with the criminal inquiries and so on, but do you think in the end he's going to end up maintaining his fame, his prestige, partly because everybody can't stop talking about him?
Well, it depends entirely on what happens with a criminal investigation, doesn't it? Depending on how that goes, the culture and the media platforms we have in the world now, you can live beyond something as damaging as this, I think.
So I guess one of the questions, Gordon, is that it's very easy to look back and say that crazy time, the 2000s or the 2010s. I don't suppose you'd say this couldn't happen again with somebody in this decade or the next decade.
It's funny.
Right?
I actually
do you think anything has fundamentally changed, that we do things differently now?
I don't think we do, actually. And, I don't buy into that notion about the noughties being particularly bad. I think the 90s were particularly bad. I think the 80s were particularly bad. I think the 70s were particularly bad. I think we're in a time now that is very dangerous. I'm deeply concerned about my children growing up with the access to technology they have. Really worried about pornography. Really worried about what they'll be exposed to. And I think, I don't think... Have we changed? I think the public... it's such a complicated thing, but I think accountability has changed as a result of social media and the way we handle news. But I think behaviours will stay the same. They just exist a little bit more under the radar. That's what worries me. It's the Andrew Tate culture.
You know the Murdoch empire much better than most people. How powerful do you think it is now? Even by comparison to your heyday, when you were there, in your 20s and 30s and so on. How powerful do you think it is now?
Well, in very specific terms for the Sun newspaper, the circulation's about a third of what it was when I left, when I was 36. So, in terms of the paying readership, it's diminished. In terms of audience, it's huge, but whether that's monetised well or not, I'm not party to those figures anymore, but there's still a huge audience for what they produce. So there's still clout, there's still power. You only need to look at the Who Cares Wins Awards on Monday night. Keir Starmer was there, Jess Phillips was there, Rishi Sunak was there. I saw countless celebrities in the room that night. I turned up, I went along. So, there's still, I think, some political clout that comes with his empire in publishing, but how the business exists beyond Russell, beyond, that's a Freudian slip, how the business exists beyond Rupert, I'm not entirely sure.
Do you think the newspapers have more power in this country than the politicians?
That's a brilliant question. It's a book, isn't it? The answer to that. No, I don't.
No?
No, I don't. No,
you don't think the newspapers tell the politicians what to do?
No, I don't.
You don't think Murdoch tells whoever's in power what they should be doing?
I don't. I think possibly in the past he would have had power and sway, but I still have faith in democracy in this country, that politicians, I feel very fortunate to have grown up with incredible political leaders. Gordon Brown lives locally to me, and I think at some stage he was very close to the Murdoch empire, but I don't think he's the kind of individual who would, be told to do anything by anybody. So yeah, I have faith in, maybe it's blind faith, I don't know, but I do have faith in democracy and politics to come true. You're looking at me like I'm an idiot now.
No. I'm kind of...
But then I'm an optimist, right? I'm a cup half full person, and I believe that good will always come out.
I was merely thinking that was a very good place to wrap up,
right.
But I was checking with Lewis in case...
Well, come on, we've got to ask a little bit just specifically about Succession. Come on, not just which character you are. Come on, you got any story?
Yeah.
Did you feed anything through in that? Come on.
I'm very concerned
between us, Gordon. When you watched Succession, when you watched it, was there any particular scene or anything you thought, That's not far from the money.
Yeah, I sent a bill, I sent an invoice saying I told that story drunk 10 years ago to Emily Maitlis in a pub, and it's clearly been...
Yeah, because I wrote Succession. We've kept that very hidden from our listeners up till now. But
I'll tell you a funny story about this podcast, though, because Martin Compston and I from Line of Duty, as you know, John Sopel and Emily were so excited to see him the other day. We got a phone call when we started the podcast saying, congratulations, lads, great news. You've got your first big commercial deal through for this podcast. So Martin treated his wife and friends to a very expensive dinner. My wife and I had a wonderful dinner, spent a lot of money. And then we got a phone call the next day saying, I'm sorry, there's been a terrible clerical error. That was actually newsagents that money was for. So thanks for that, guys.
That up, we can't actually
we will definitely wrap
that,
up there.
can we?
Yes, you can.
So, Succession.
Yeah.
What was the bit that rings the truest?
You're not going to let me off easily on this.
No. Was it worldly recognised?
Some of us are slightly more obsessed than others.
Yeah, if I said to you that I had, flown on the private jet in Scotland from one airport to another in double quick time, that, and some of the stuff that happened around that kind of appeared.
You've worked closely with Rupert Murdoch.
I have, yeah. I was editor of the Scottish Sun during the referendum, so yeah, I had to deal very closely with him because he believes in Scotland. He thinks his grandfather was Scottish, so.
What does that mean, believe in Scotland? Did he want...
Well, I think he's a huge advocate of our innovation in engineering and history and business and economics and Adam Smith and, the great forefathers of Scotland.
Was he slightly swayed? Did he want independence?
That's a wonderful question, Emily, and I'm not actually allowed to talk about that because of the restricted covenants in my contract. But what I would tell you is that, I think there's no secret of it that he said his favourite workforce was in Scotland when Sky had... call centres in Livingston and Dunfermline.
He took a close interest in the referendum.
Very, very close interest in Scotland. He was very hands-on in the independence referendum.
Do you think he still takes a close interest?
And was he happy with the result?
I was very happy with the way it played out for the paper because I argued that we should sit on the fence. And in terms of Sun history, that's probably career suicide. I might explain why I'm not working there anymore, but I felt like it was too important a decision for us to tell an audience or a readership what they should do. You would potentially alienate half your readership in it was such a toxic time. I'd never seen my parents and family argue over politics so much. And then I'm, in a situation where I'm having these conversations with Rupert Murdoch and with the lieutenants and generals in London. I couldn't stop and get petrol without somebody having a go at me about, we know you're backing yes and we know you're a no voter. Everybody assumed, nobody knows my politics. I've never explained my politics to anybody because it's the best piece of advice I got from my dad. It's your own personal view. Don't talk about it because it just leads to arguments and great podcasts.
Was it hard being the editor of the Scottish Sun sometimes?
Yeah, it was incredibly difficult, yeah.
I mean in terms of being in Scotland.
I found it incredibly difficult. It was one of the hardest spells of my life. I went on a Friday from being the showbiz guy interviewing celebrities to sitting down with Alex Salmond having a conversation about the Constitution and the future of the country and how my children would grow up in it. And the first thing he said to me is, they tell me, son, you used to work in music. And I said, that's right, Alec. And he said, yeah, what do you make of that guy Justin Timberhouse? And I thought, oh God, what have I done?
But in terms of how people responded to you,
I found I had quite a good experience from my time in showbiz, right? But then when I suddenly received those Christmas cards from Ed Miliband and David Cameron, I thought, I don't know you, why are you sending me Christmas cards? And then when I came back to London as deputy editor in 2016 for the European referendum, which was a barrel of laughs, those Christmas cards stopped coming. But then I'm sure if I had then become editor of the Sun, I would have been their best friend again. So, let's make it absolutely clear that I was courted and encouraged. The best thing for me, right, I used to obviously dress in a suit when I worked for the Sun. They used to say you'd have to dress every day like you meet the Queen. And I'd get on the same flight as Lorraine Kelly and Kay Adams flying backwards and forwards to Scotland. And then suddenly I was working in music radio and back doing that, so dressed casually. And there were politicians who didn't recognise me at all because they couldn't see the difference in this person. But Gordon Brown could, and he's partially sighted. And I thought that said an awful lot about him when I'd pass him on the plane. In economy, might I add. And he'd say, hello, Gordon, how are you doing? Great, thank you for asking, Gordon, how are you? And, I found it really difficult. I'm not going to lie, I was 32 when I was editor of the Scottish Sun until I was 35. I was managing the pressure of Rupert Murdoch's interest in it. You're managing a declining circulation. You've also got the HR issues of managing 150 complicated Glaswegians, which was a test. You've got to deal with the old firm, religious bigotry, sectarianism, an incredibly busy crime patch. I saw the helicopter crash within my first 3 weeks in the Cluth. I was one of the witnesses. So then you're part of a fatal accident inquiry. Then the bin lorry tragedy happened. Alexander Pactow was a brutal murderer who was convicted when I was there. A young boy, Mikhail Kuler, was murdered by his mum, which was a horrendous story. And I had 2 children under 3 at the same time. my wife had moved back from all of her friends to rural Scotland. We were living in a very cold Scottish house that hadn't been renovated. And, you know, at that stage of your life, it's a difficult time. I was also processing everything that had just happened with the Leveson stuff, and the criminal inquiries were ongoing. There were civil cases ongoing. And I suddenly thought, how have I ended up doing this? I actually applied to work for the BBC and didn't get a job. And I thought, maybe I could have been working at Pebble Mill.
Do you think anything changed after Leveson?
I do. I certainly changed from the experience.
But the papers changed, you think?
Yeah, I do. I do, actually. I do. I mean, loads of people would probably laugh at me for that, but I certainly think my behaviour changed, and I analysed my role in show business and the public eye.
And finally, I know you can't talk about him much, but in terms of Murdoch, do you think two things? Does he still take an active interest in British politics? And what do you think is going to happen to the empire when eventually someone does succeed?
Two massive questions again, Lewis. Of course he does in terms of his political engagement. I think he's fascinated by politics in this country, but my appraisal and view of it is that Rupert isn't actually interested in the political party or the political movement. He's interested in his empire and his business, you know, and whoever suits his interest, that's who he would support. And the second question, what was the second question, Liz?
What happens to the empire when succession actually happens?
Well, I knew that was the second question. I was trying to buy myself time.
Well,
I think that's a massive question. You know, I spent a bit of time with Lachlan. I think he has a genuine care for the print publishing
his
business.
son, of course,
his son
Lachlan
Lachlan,
Murdoch,
yeah, Kendall. I think he genuinely cares about the publishing business in the UK. So he'll always, I think, look out for that business.
I'm thinking it's Roman. We could have that debate.
I just threw that.
Who's out?
The next show.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, by the way.
Thank you.
And look,
Thanks for coming in.
I think it's really important for me to finish by saying the victims of the alleged sex crimes are the ones who count in this, and I'm not in any way defending Russell. Hopefully I've given a bit of a picture of the culture that existed around that at the time, and maybe there's some more understanding, because we all have to pay attention to our individual role in all of that at the time.
Gordon,
Understood.
thanks so much for coming in.
you.
It's so fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.